Everyone knows the French Revolution as a tale of liberty, equality, and defiance against oppression. But few understand that it began with arithmetic, not ideals. It wasn't the storming of the Bastille that destroyed France. It was the storming of its balance sheet. The guillotine came later. The debt came first. Behind the slogans and chaos, the cause was painfully clear. The state went bankrupt. France didn't fall because of monarchy. It fell because it ran out of credit. And when a government can't borrow, print, or tax enough to survive, history answers the same way: revolution. Before we go further, let's make this interactive. Tell me, from which country are you watching, and what time is it for you right now? Drop your answer in the comments. It helps show how far this story travels, because what happened in France could happen anywhere. And if you've already learned something new, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm you value real history, not the sugar-coated version from textbooks. Now, rewind to France in the 1700s. The nation was rich in culture, art, and prestige. Paris was Europe's beating heart. But beneath the glitter, its finances were crumbling. The royal treasury was nearly dry, drained by decades of warfare and extravagance. Louis XIV had poured fortunes into Versailles and endless campaigns. His heirs inherited the throne and his debts. By 1780, France owed more than 4 billion livres, a figure impossible to repay with its broken tax system. Interest payments alone devoured half the annual budget. The deeper sickness was structural. France's tax code was rigged from the top down. The nobility and clergy, the wealthiest classes, paid next to nothing. The burden fell on peasants, merchants, and workers. Picture a country where small businesses are taxed at 80%, while billionaires get exemptions. That was France in 1788. The system crushed the productive and protected the privileged, the same elite who lent money to the crown and blocked reform. But debt doesn't wait for politics. It compounds, and France's creditors demanded payment in gold, not promises. The 7 Years' War had already emptied the treasury. Then came the American Revolution. France spent over 1.3 billion livres to help America defeat Britain, a victory abroad, but financial suicide at home. Soldiers returned triumphant. The government returned bankrupt. When Jacques Necker, the finance minister, unveiled the royal accounts, he did something radical. He made them public. For the first time, ordinary citizens saw the numbers. Instead of inspiring trust, it fueled fury. If France was wealthy, why was bread unaffordable? If the king was wise, why were peasants starving? Necker's report turned finance into politics, and politics into outrage. In 1788, the crown did what modern governments still do in crisis. It tried to borrow more. But Europe's lenders had lost faith. Bond prices collapsed. Interest rates soared. No new credit could be raised. The tax base was exhausted. Inflation crept upward. Then nature struck, failed. Harvests sent grain prices skyrocketing. Bread, the cornerstone of French life, tripled in cost. While peasants starved, aristocrats feasted. Every empire learns the same truth. When the cost of food rises faster than wages, revolution begins. Paris ignited. But before mobs filled the streets, the collapse began quietly, in offices and ledgers. Economists call it a liquidity crisis. Historians call it a breaking point. In France, it began with a single refusal to tax the rich. By 1789, Louis XVI was cornered. His advisors urged him to summon the Estates General, a national assembly that hadn't convened in 175 years. The goal was negotiation. The outcome was rebellion. Representatives of the Third Estate, everyone outside the nobility and clergy, refused exclusion. They declared themselves the legitimate government, the National Assembly. And what ignited it all? Not liberty, not democracy, debt. When a society built on privilege hits financial collapse, it implodes from within. The crown couldn't pay soldiers, pensions, or grain shipments. Its promises turned worthless. Paper notes called assignats were printed against confiscated church land, an early experiment in quantitative easing. At first, it worked. Then printing accelerated, trust dissolved, and assignats lost value. No one wanted royal paper anymore. Here, economics met emotion. Hunger bred desperation. Inflation bred fury. Injustice gave it purpose. When the crowd stormed the Bastille in July 1789, they weren't debating fiscal theory, they were living its consequences. The Dint collapse that made the revolution inevitable had already happened. France wasn't an economy anymore. It was a pyramid of IOUs balanced on privilege, waiting for gravity. If you think this is just history, think again. The pattern repeats. Government spends more than it earns. It borrows to fill the gap. It promises reform but delays it. Then debt. Service consumes everything else. Shortages follow. Prices rise. Anger builds. Every empire that ignores fiscal limits faces the same reckoning. The French Revolution wasn't spontaneous. It was arithmetic. The numbers failed before the people did, and when you study it closely, you see familiar signs: unequal taxation, reckless spending, experimental central banking, and monetary innovation masking decay. The faces change. The math does not. We're not finished yet, because in the next part, we'll uncover how financial collapse gave birth to a dangerous new idea, that money itself could be political. France tried to solve its debt crisis by reinventing value, and in doing so, created one of history's first experiments in fiat currency. But the price was immense: hyperinflation, distrust, and the death of an entire order. Stay tuned, because what comes next proves revolutions don't just topple rulers, they rewrite the meaning of money. When the monarchy fell under its debts, the revolutionaries inherited more than power. They inherited ruin. The treasury was empty. Credit was frozen. Gold had fled the country. France couldn't tax fast enough to feed its army or its people. So the new government tried something radical. It turned land into currency. They seized property from the church and aristocracy, more than 6 million hectares of prime European soil. On paper, it was vast wealth. In practice, it was immovable. You can't buy bread in Paris with farmland. So they built a bridge, paper money, called assignats, backed by that confiscated land. Each note represented a slice of future value. At first, it was brilliant. Issue notes, sell the land. Repay debt. It worked, in theory, but in practice, it opened a spiral no one could stop. Initially, the assignats succeeded. Trade revived. Farmers sold grain. Workers were paid again. Confidence returned. The markets exhaled. But once a government learns to print money, stopping becomes impossible. Expenses grew. Armies, bread, supplies. The presses rolled faster. Soon, assignats were no longer tied to land. They became paper promises stacked on other promises. By 1793, more than 8 billion livres circulated. Prices exploded. Bread that cost 4 sous now cost 12. A pair of shoes that once took a week's wage now cost a month's pay. Inflation punished savers, rewarded gamblers, and destroyed trust. Markets disintegrated. Merchants hoarded goods. Farmers refused paper. The black market flourished. Ordinary people who thought they'd escaped royal exploitation now paid a new invisible tax. Inflation. Economists later called it revolutionary inflation, but to those living through it, it was desperation. The National Convention fought back with decrees. They fixed prices, banned hoarding, and branded traders as enemies. Bakers were guillotined for raising prices, but laws can't override scarcity. The more they printed, the faster value vanished. Here's the irony. The same revolution that executed a king for fiscal failure repeated his mistakes. They believed purity could overrule mathematics. They were wrong. You can't legislate. Trust. Once people believe their money is worthless, No proclamation can change their minds. Foreign powers watched in disbelief. Britain and Austria mocked the chaos, but they missed the deeper revolution. For the first time, a nation tried to link political sovereignty directly to money creation. The revolutionaries didn't just seek freedom from monarchy, they sought freedom from financiers. Before 1789, private lenders controlled credit. Now, the state tried to seize that power. It was a struggle over who defines value, the crown, the market, or the people. That question reshaped the modern world. The assignats were the first true fiat currency, money backed not by metal, but belief. Every modern central bank echoes that experiment. When the Federal Reserve expands its balance sheet, or when Europe prints to stabilize markets, it repeats what France did in 1790, only with restraint. France had no restraint. It printed blindly, feeding need with paper. Discipline vanished, and faith with it. Pause for a key truth. Revolutions promise justice, but often deliver experiments in economics. The French discovered that moral conviction doesn't ensure fiscal control. They replaced nobles with bureaucrats, kings with committees, yet the debt engine kept running. The wars that followed consumed everything. By 1794, the presses thundered day and night. Over 45 billion livres were printed in assignats. Inflation soared beyond 13,000%. A loaf of bread cost more than a day's wage. Metal coins disappeared. People bartered again. It was a regression to survival. Soldiers demanded payment in gold. Merchants hid their savings. The dream of paper prosperity died. And when money dies, violence follows. As assignats collapsed, so did faith. Not just in currency, but in the revolution itself. Factions turned on each other. The Girondins accused the Jacobins of corruption. The Jacobins accused merchants of greed. The Committee of Public Safety unleashed terror. Executions surged. Fiscal collapse bred paranoia, and paranoia justified blood. Here's the hard truth. Monetary failure is never neutral. It rearranges power. Whoever controls money controls survival. In France, that control passed from monarchs to committees to generals. Each promised order, and each needed funds. Out of that chaos rose Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon understood what the revolutionaries ignored. Power demands stable credit. In 1800, he founded the Bank of France, half public, half private, to rebuild trust. The message was unmistakable. Ideals without solvency collapse into tyranny or dependence. Freedom requires financial order. Now fast forward to the present. When central banks flood economies with liquidity and crisis, they replay fragments of France's experiment. They say it's temporary. They say it's managed. So did the National Assembly. Every inflationary spiral begins with good intentions, feeding the poor, saving jobs, securing stability, but each one ends by testing the same question. How much faith does your paper still hold? In France, trust evaporated long before gold did, and that, not the guillotine, was the real end of the revolution. Once the paper was worth less than the ink it carried, people stopped believing. That instant when confidence dies is the moment revolutions consume themselves. France's collapse shattered an old illusion that riches equal resilience. The nation overflowed with land, art, and labor, yet starved for discipline. It spent like an empire, borrowed like a gambler. No resource survives endless extraction. The hidden economics of revolution weren't theory. They lived in wages, markets, and bread lines. They turned philosophy into hunger and proved that no ideology, royal or republican, can outpace arithmetic. In the next part, we'll uncover how this financial breakdown reshaped the world's idea of money. Because from France's ruin came a warning. Every political revolution creates an economic one, and those shifts don't end when the cannons fall silent. France's fiscal implosion didn't stay contained. What happened between 1789 and 1799? rewired global finance. For the first time, investors saw political change obliterate an entire currency. The assignat disaster showed what happens when states print instead of reform. Trust, once fractured, rarely returns. After the revolution, foreign creditors eyed new republics with fear. When Latin America sought loans decades later, London's bankers demanded steep premiums. They remembered France. The danger wasn't armies, it was ideology. If a government could void property or debase paper overnight, contracts meant nothing. The French Revolution cemented a permanent struggle between democracy and debt. Public will wanted spending, financial order required restraint. The two almost never coexisted. Inside France, the aftermath was paradoxical. The monarchies fall freed citizens from feudal dues and noble privilege, yet inflation erased small fortunes. Overnight, farmers who sold crops for paper lost everything when prices collapsed. Merchants who guessed correctly on timing grew rich. Fate replaced birth as the new hierarchy. Instability bred cynicism and a new reverence for metal. The French began trusting coins more than paper. Gold and silver became symbols of certainty. When Napoleon seized power, he restored the franc, anchored partly to gold and silver. The new regime promised balance, predictability, and solvency. After a decade of chaos, stability felt like salvation for the people. Fiscal order was the true revolution. But the ideas born in France didn't stop there. The realization that money itself was political spread across Europe. Central banks, once rare curiosities, multiplied. Governments learned they needed credit. Institutions insulated from factional politics, or at least appearing to be. The Bank of England, already ancient, gained prestige. The Bank of France, founded by Napoleon, became the blueprint for modern hybrids, public oversight with private muscle. These new institutions addressed the flaw France had exposed. A nation cannot run on passion alone. Liberty, equality, fraternity, inspiring, but they didn't fund grain or armies. The revolution carved a lasting truth. Economic order is the skeleton beneath political flesh. Break it, and everything else collapses. Now zoom out. Why does this matter today? Because every modern nation wrestles with the same temptation. When crisis strikes, recession, war, pandemic, printing looks painless. Leaders promise relief, forgiveness, and recovery. But behind every promise hides the same arithmetic that doomed France. If output lags behind spending, paper fills the gap, and paper without faith turns to dust. Look at Argentina's peso, Zimbabwe's dollar, Venezuela's bolivar. Each followed the French script. Deficits, debasement, collapse. Each claimed its case was unique. Each proved the same law. Economics ignores ideology. It only tallies balance. Now trace the ripple from 1789 to the modern era. Central banks, inflation targets, and bond markets all emerged as lessons from France's failure. The notion of separating money creation from politics was born in that chaos. Economists, like David Ricardo and later John Maynard Keynes, studied those scars. They saw that money is not wealth. It is merely a claim on it. When claims exceed what exists, collapse follows. The revolution also redefined taxation. Before 1789, taxes were privileges, bargains between estates. Afterward, they became universal duties. That shift built the fiscal state we know today, one that taxes all, but promises representation in return. No taxation without representation was not just American rhetoric. It became a French survival strategy. Once citizens dethroned a king, they had to finance their own republic. Equality required contribution, but equal taxation did not ensure equal outcomes. The turmoil birthed a new elite, bankers, traders, and speculators fluent in paper. They replaced nobles with numbers. The class born from the revolution became the financial aristocracy of the 19th century. In a bitter irony, a revolt against privilege forged a new one, based not on birthright, but on balance sheets. The moral is stark. Revolutions don't erase debt. They redistribute it. The question isn't who writes in red ink, it's who holds the pen. Every new regime inherits the liabilities of the last. Financial or moral, France's republic began as a fiscal rescue and ended as an empire built on conquest. Napoleon paid his troops with plunder because domestic credit was gone. War replaced reform as revenue. When war becomes economy, peace becomes fantasy. Today, nations avoid that path by issuing bonds instead of sending armies, but the logic remains. Every treasury bill, every deficit budget is a modern assignat, a promise on tomorrow's income. The form changed. The dependents did not. Think of your own country. When leaders debate deficits or stimulus, they're reenacting 1789 with better printers. How much spending is sustainable? When does borrowing become bondage? France answered that question in blood. The world still hasn't. There's another layer most forget. The revolution didn't just expose financial fragility, it rewrote the definition of value. Before 1790, money was physical. Gold, silver, weight you could hold. After the assignats, value became belief. Confidence in the issuer replaced the metal itself. That single shift made modern capitalism possible. Stock markets, credit, and bonds all rest on that same invisible faith. Without France's failure, modern finance might never have taken shape. Pain built the precedent. If a state could redefine money, so could a market. In that sense, every investor alive owes a debt to 1790. Let's close with perspective. The French Revolution is remembered as a clash of classes and ideals. But beneath the slogans lay a broken. Spreadsheet numbers sparked mobs. Inflation turned reform into terror. And the attempt to print prosperity created a new kind of poverty, one measured in lost faith. Next time you hear debates about inflation or deficit spending, remember Paris, 1793, remember the breadlines, the worthless notes, the promises that couldn't buy food. Remember how quickly freedom fractures when numbers stop adding up. If you learned something new, share where you're watching from, and tell me, do you think today's economies are wiser than revolutionary France? Or are we making the same mistake with shinier machines? Your comment helps shape the next story. Thanks for watching till the end. If you're curious how debt and money shaped other revolutions, subscribe. Next, we'll uncover how the American experiment dodged France's fate, and what that escape really cost.